What if I told you that one of the most horrifying chapters of World War II has been deliberately hidden from your history books? A story so disturbing it challenges our understanding of human cruelty. This isn't about the battlefields you know. It's about a secret place, a factory of death disguised as a research facility, where science was twisted into a weapon of unimaginable horror. This is the story of a secret Imperial Japanese Army unit, known by a simple, chilling code name, Unit 731. For decades, its existence was denied, its crimes buried under a pact of silence. But the truth has a way of clawing its way to the surface, and what it reveals is a nightmare beyond comprehension, a tale of human experimentation so grotesque, it makes the monstrous acts of the Nazis seem almost rivaled. Prepare yourself, because we are about to descend into the darkness of Pingfang, Manchuria, and uncover the secret history of the unit that treated human beings as disposable logs, and the cold-blooded deal that allowed its architects to walk free. The mastermind behind this abyss of suffering was a man named Shiro Ishii. He wasn't a stereotypical, brutish commander. He was a brilliant microbiologist, a graduate of the prestigious Kyoto Imperial University, and a physician in the Imperial Japanese Army. But beneath the veneer of intellect lay a chilling ambition and a complete absence of morality. Ishii was obsessed with one thing: biological warfare. He believed it was the ultimate weapon, cheap to produce and capable of wiping out entire populations. He saw it as the key to Japan's imperial dominance. In the early 1930s, he toured biological warfare facilities in Europe and America, not with horror, but with a student's eye, taking notes, absorbing techniques, and imagining how he could surpass them. Upon his return, he began a relentless campaign to convince the highest echelons of the Japanese military. He argued that international bans on germ warfare were a sign of weakness, and that Japan needed to develop these weapons to survive and conquer. His charisma and scientific authority were persuasive. The high command, particularly the powerful Kempeitai secret police, saw the terrifying potential. They gave Ishii what he wanted: unlimited funding, absolute authority, and a secret location far from the prying eyes of the Japanese public and the world. They gave him a kingdom where he could play God, with no rules and no consequences. In 1936, construction began on a massive, top-secret complex in the Pingfang district, just south of the city of Harbin in Japanese-occupied Manchuria. To the outside world, it was given a deliberately mundane and benevolent name: the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Kwantung Army. It was a lie, a carefully constructed facade to hide a monstrous reality. This was no public health facility. It was a sprawling death camp, covering 6 square kilometers. The complex was a self-contained city of horror, boasting over 150 buildings, including laboratories, barracks, autopsy rooms, and crematoria with towering smokestacks that ran day and night. It had its own airfield, its own railway line, and its own power plant. Security was absolute. The entire compound was surrounded by high walls, electrified fences, and deep moats. Guards patrolled constantly. Anyone who got too close was shot without warning. The local population lived in terror, whispering stories of the strange smells and the constant smoke, but they knew better than to ask questions. Inside this fortress, Shiro Ishii and his staff of Japan's brightest doctors, scientists, and researchers prepared to begin their work. They were about to embark on a program of human experimentation that would defy belief, a systematic campaign of torture and murder in the name of science. The human beings brought to Unit 731 were stripped of their names, their identities, their very humanity. To the researchers, they were no longer people. They were given a new, chilling designation: Maruta, the Japanese word for logs. This wasn't just a code name, it was a psychological tool. You don't feel empathy for a log of wood. You can cut it, burn it, and discard it without a second thought. And that is precisely what they did. The Maruta were primarily Chinese civilians and prisoners of war, captured by the Kempeitai. But they also included Russians, Mongolians, Koreans, and even a small number of Allied POWs. They were men, women, and children. They were resistance fighters, intellectuals, common criminals, and sometimes just people who were in the wrong place at the wrong time, rounded up to meet the facility's insatiable demand for fresh test subjects. It's estimated that at least 3,000 people were experimented on and killed inside the Pingfang facility, with some estimates reaching as high as 12,000. Tens of thousands more would die from the biological weapons tested on their cities. Once inside the walls of Unit 731, there was no escape. The prisoners were kept in cells, well-fed and exercised, not out of kindness, but to ensure they were healthy specimens for the gruesome experiments that awaited them. They were living, breathing raw material for a factory whose only product was death. The core of Unit 731's work was vivisection, the act of dissecting a living organism, and they performed it on conscious human beings. Prisoners were tied down to operating tables, often without any anesthesia. The researchers believed that anesthetics could taint the results, altering the physiology of the organs they were studying. So the victims were fully awake, fully aware, as scalpels cut into their skin. They would remove organs piece by piece to study the effects of disease or trauma. They would amputate limbs to study blood loss. They injected animal blood into humans to see the reaction. In one of the most depraved series of experiments, they would impregnate female prisoners and vivisect them at different stages of pregnancy, sometimes removing the living fetus to study it. They performed these procedures on men, women, and even infants born inside the facility. The screams of the victims echoed through the sterile halls, ignored by the doctors and scientists in their white coats, who meticulously took notes and timed the procedures with stopwatches. To them, it wasn't torture, it was data collection. After the procedure, the victim, if still alive, was either killed and incinerated or sent back to their cell to recover for the next experiment. No one ever survived the operating table of Unit 731, but vivisection was just one facet of the horror. Shiro Ishii's primary goal was to weaponize the world's most deadly diseases. Unit 731 became a breeding ground for pathogens. They cultivated massive quantities of bacteria responsible for the plague, anthrax, cholera, typhoid, dysentery, and gas gangrene. The Maruta were their human petri dishes. Prisoners were forcibly infected in a variety of cruel ways. They were given contaminated food and water to study the onset of intestinal diseases. They were injected directly with deadly cultures. They were tied to stakes in open fields while planes flew overhead, dropping ceramic bombs filled not with explosives, but with plague-infested fleas. The researchers would then observe, with detached clinical interest, as the diseases ravaged the victims' bodies. They documented every symptom, the soaring fevers, the violent convulsions, the painful lesions, the agonizing death. They would then vivisect the victims at different stages of the illness to see exactly how the bacteria were destroying the body from the inside out. They even developed special projectiles, like a porcelain bomb, designed to shatter on impact and spread pathogens and shrapnel over a wide area, maximizing infection. This research wasn't just theoretical. It was a prelude to mass murder on an unprecedented scale. Unit 731 wasn't just a laboratory, it was also a weapons testing ground. The Japanese military wanted to know the exact effectiveness of their conventional armaments, and the Maruta were their human targets. Prisoners were taken to a proving ground outside the main complex. They were tied to stakes, arranged in rows at varying distances. Then, the tests would begin. Grenades were thrown into their midst to see the precise pattern of shrapnel damage. Flamethrowers were turned on them to determine the range and intensity needed for a lethal burn. They were used to test chemical weapons, sealed in chambers and exposed to poison gas. They were bombed from the air to test new explosives. In one set of experiments, researchers wanted to see how much the human body could endure. They placed victims inside high-pressure chambers until their eyes popped from their sockets. They spun them in giant centrifuges until they died. They deprived them of food and water to see how long it took to starve. They exposed them to lethal doses of X-rays. They even buried people alive. Every conceivable method of killing and maiming was explored, documented, and refined. The goal was simple and ruthless: to build a more efficient killing machine, using human lives as nothing more than calibration tools. Among the most infamous and uniquely cruel experiments conducted at Unit 731 were the frostbite trials. Manchuria's winters are brutally cold, with temperatures often dropping to -40 degrees. Ishii's researchers saw this as a perfect natural laboratory to study the effects of frostbite on Japanese soldiers. To do this, they needed human subjects. Prisoners were forced outside in the dead of winter, sometimes naked, with their arms submerged in barrels of icy water. They were left there for hours until their limbs were frozen solid. A guard would periodically tap the arm with a short stick, and when it made the sound of a block of wood, the experiment was ready to proceed. The researchers then tested various cures. Some victims had hot water poured on their frozen limbs, a shockingly painful process that often caused the flesh to peel away from the bone, leaving a grisly skeletonized arm. Others had their limbs left to thaw naturally. Some were simply bludgeoned with clubs to see if the trauma had any effect. The goal was to find the best way to treat frostbitten soldiers on the battlefield. But for the Maruta, it was just another form of excruciating torture. They were observed and documented as gangrene set in, their limbs turning black and rotting away while they were still alive. If they survived the initial experiment, their useless, necrotic limbs were often amputated without anesthetic before they were used for another test, perhaps germ warfare or vivisection, until their bodies finally gave out. The work of Unit 731 did not remain confined within its electric fences. Shiro Ishii was eager to see his creations in action. Beginning in the late 1930s, Unit 731 and its subsidiary units began conducting field tests, unleashing biological warfare on an unsuspecting Chinese population. These were not tests, they were acts of mass terror and murder. Japanese planes flew over Chinese cities and villages, dropping the ceramic bombs they had developed, filled with plague-infested fleas. They contaminated wells and reservoirs with cholera and typhoid. They dropped contaminated food, like dumplings and grain, in areas racked by famine, knowing desperate people would eat them. One of the most well-documented attacks occurred in 1940 over the city of Ningbo. A Japanese plane dropped a spray of wheat and fleas carrying the bubonic plague. Days later, an epidemic erupted, killing hundreds. Similar attacks were carried out on other cities, including Chang, causing devastating outbreaks of plague, cholera, and anthrax that continued to kill people for years after the initial attack. The exact death toll from these biological attacks is impossible to calculate, but conservative estimates place it in the tens of thousands, with some historians arguing the number is closer to 500,000 civilians. This was Shiro Ishii's vision realized: silent, invisible warfare that killed indiscriminately, turning entire communities into vast, open-air experiments. It was a war crime of staggering proportions, committed with a scientist's precision and a sociopath's indifference. By the summer of 1945, the tide of the war had turned. The Japanese Empire was collapsing. On August 9th, the Soviet Union invaded Manchuria, their forces advancing rapidly towards Pingfang. For Shiro Ishii and the staff of Unit 731, the end was near. Panic set in. Their primary objective was no longer research, it was destruction of all evidence. Ishii gave the order to begin a frantic, systematic cover-up. He told his staff, the secrets of this unit must be taken to the grave. The buildings were dynamited. Tons of incriminating documents, research notes, and photographic evidence were burned in massive bonfires. The remaining Maruta, the last living witnesses to the horrors, were all murdered. They were poisoned, shot, or gassed, and their bodies were thrown into pits and incinerated. The crematoria worked overtime for days, trying to erase the thousands of lives they had taken. In a final, malicious act, Ishii ordered the release of thousands of plague-infested rats and fleas into the surrounding countryside, triggering a new wave of epidemics that killed thousands more Chinese civilians even after the war had ended. Ishii then gathered his key personnel. He provided them with cyanide vials, urging them to commit suicide if captured. He arranged for a special train to evacuate them and their families back to Japan, along with the most crucial research data that they managed to salvage. As the Soviet army rolled into the smoldering ruins of the Pingfeng complex, they found a scene of hurried destruction, but the architects of its horrors had vanished, melting back into a defeated Japan, carrying their dark secrets with them. One would expect the story to end here, with the leaders of Unit 731 being hunted down and brought to justice, just like their Nazi counterparts at the Nuremberg trials. But that is not what happened. Instead, one of the most cynical and morally compromising deals of the 20th century was struck. In the chaos of post-war Japan, American intelligence officers from Fort Detrick, the center of the U.S. biological weapons program, quickly learned of Unit 731's existence and the nature of its research. They saw not a trove of war crimes, but a scientific goldmine. The Americans were desperate to know what the Japanese had learned. The data from Unit 731's human experiments was priceless to them, something they could never replicate due to ethical and legal constraints. They had data on how diseases affected the human body, how pathogens could be aerosolized, and the effectiveness of various biological agents. It was a quantum leap for their own bioweapons research as the Cold War with the Soviet Union began to simmer. So, they made a deal with the devil. General Douglas MacArthur, the supreme commander of the Allied powers in Japan, secretly granted full immunity from war crimes prosecution to Shiro Ishii and all his top researchers. In exchange for this clemency, they had to hand over all their research data, their slides, their autopsy reports, and provide detailed debriefings. The price for this invaluable data was justice. Shiro Ishii, the man who had personally overseen the torture and murder of thousands, was never charged with a single crime. He lived out the rest of his life in peace, dying of throat cancer in 1959. The same was true for his lieutenants. While Nazi doctors were being hanged for their crimes against humanity, the doctors of Unit 731 were protected, some even going on to have prominent careers in post-war Japan's medical schools, pharmaceutical companies, and government health ministries. The American government classified the information, and for decades, the story of Unit 731 was buried under a blanket of official silence. For decades after the war, the Japanese government officially denied the existence of Unit 731. It was a non-subject, erased from textbooks and public discourse. To the world and to many of its own people, it simply never happened. The victims received no acknowledgement, no apology, and no justice. But the truth could not stay buried forever. In the 1980s, a courageous Japanese journalist and historian named Seiichi Morimura published a shocking expose titled The Devil's Gluttony. Based on the testimonies of former unit members, it revealed the horrific activities of Unit 731 to the Japanese public for the first time, causing a national scandal. Slowly, more former members, haunted by guilt in their old age, began to come forward. Brave Chinese victims and their families began to file lawsuits, demanding recognition and compensation. Despite the mounting evidence, official recognition has been slow and grudging. It wasn't until 1998 that Japan's Supreme Court acknowledged the existence of the unit, but it still refused to award compensation to the victims. Even today, the full story of Unit 731 is not widely taught or known, especially when compared to the Holocaust in Europe. It remains a dark, shameful secret, a ghost that haunts the conscience of a nation and its powerful ally who chose data over justice. So why is it crucial that we remember this horrifying story? We remember Unit 731 not to sensationalize horror, but to understand the terrifying depths humanity can sink to when science is divorced from morality, when nationalism runs rampant, and when human beings are dehumanized. It stands as a stark warning of the dangers of unchecked state power and the justification of atrocity in the name of progress or national security. It also serves as a deeply uncomfortable reminder of the cynical calculations of geopolitics, where the pursuit of a strategic advantage can lead to the pardoning of monsters. The victims of Unit 731, the Maruta, were denied justice in their lifetime. They were erased, first by their murderers and then by the silence of history. The very least we can do is remember them. We must tell their story, acknowledge their suffering, and learn the brutal lessons their sacrifice teaches us. Because forgetting such darkness doesn't make it go away. It only makes it more likely to happen again.